Every year they come from all over Vermont, from the smaller towns and the larger cities. Some of them farmers, some of them lawyers, doctors, store clerks, but all of them elected representatives of their local communities. And they meet in Montpelier to govern. Join me now as Adelphia Cable Communications takes us inside the State House. Hello and welcome to the 8th program in what should be a 15-week series. That is, if the legislature adjourns in its scheduled April 15th deadline. We'll open the program with the governor's press conference held Thursday afternoon.
I'm going off to the National Governors Association conference this weekend, and one of the main areas of concern will be environmental and energy issues. A proposal that I will be making to the NGA will call for a regional fuel reserve. And our preliminary homework on this resolution indicates that there is widespread support for it. It really stems from our experience with the spike in energy prices that we saw, particularly in propane, somewhat in fuel oil, during the very cold December.
The way these press conferences normally work is the governor will open up by addressing some issue, such as this week, her upcoming trip. She then opens up the discussion to questions from the media representatives, hoping, I suppose, that the questions will somehow relate to the topic that she's addressed. Well, this week that was not to be. The weekly sparring match seemed to keep coming back to 3 topics. One was the governor's press secretary, who was noticeably absent from the session, although he normally does attend. Absent not by his own choice either, but because of a 2-week suspension that was dealt to him as a result of some sexist remarks that he made to a female newspaper reporter earlier this week. Despite several reporters trying a number of different questions, the governor's response was nearly identical to them all.
I have made my statement about Peter Frame, and I think my position is very clear at this time, so I am not going to comment any further about it. Thank you. I really haven't checked.
Did you say that this is been a political problem for you?
I just will repeat what I've said, and that is we've dealt with the situation. It is a personnel matter. Everything that I have decided has been made available to the press, and I'm not going to comment any further on it.
Will Peter be returning to the same job when he comes back?
I think I will go back to my statement. I've really answered the question. I think that's it. Be glad to. I've answered the question, all the questions I'm going to answer about Peter. And if you read the letter, you'll see that the last sentence in the letter, I think, addresses your concern.
Governor, I'm curious, what new information did you get between Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday afternoon that caused you to suspend Peter Frame?
I'm sorry, I have answered all the questions about Peter, and I'm really not going to open up that again. No, we've discussed it. It's over. We've taken the measures.
But I've never seen in a letter form or anywhere what you didn't know on Tuesday, what you didn't know on Wednesday.
I'm just not going to answer any more questions, but thank you.
Another recurring theme was Act 200 and the authority of regional commissions to reject town plans. Last week, the governor indicated she would consider accepting the revisions proposed by Democratic Senator Douglas Racine. It seemed to many observers like a halfway move toward fully embracing the proposed corrections before town meeting. But this week, the governor was back to her hard-line defense of the act as is, with regional commissions retaining the authority to reject town plans.
I am 100% behind Act 200 and the regional concept of regional approval.
Well, is it important, I guess what I'm a little confused about it, is whether or not you feel it's critical to have regional review?
Yes, I do.
Plans.
Absolutely, I do.
So
There's should be no confusion on that. I think that's the heart of Act 200, is to have the regional review process.
The third topic to receive repeated attention were budget proposals, including the governor's Third Century Trust.
Well, it may have to be modified. It will have to be modified. I mean, we asked for $8 million in the Land Conservation and Housing Trust Fund. I'm hoping we can continue to put money into the Housing and Conservation Trust Fund. I can't at this point guarantee that it will be $8 million. I think that will be very difficult to do in light of the changing revenue picture. That's just being realistic.
And the bonding part?
The bonding, I feel that we have an excellent chance of getting a 3-year, $100 million commitment.
Well, we've just come from the press conference with Governor Kunin, and we're talking now with Representative Sara Geer. Sara can give us kind of a Republican response to the Democratic press conference. Sara, one of the things that came out of the press conference, it seemed like last week the governor was open to some reconsideration of regional approval of town plans under Act 200. This week she was very firm that she would like to see no changes. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that's a real error on her part, because I think changes in Act 200 would be appropriate because they're a response to a groundswell of public opinion and dissatisfaction with the law as it was passed. And I think government should respond to people's needs, and the message I'm hearing is that the law doesn't meet their needs, and it is not what they want, and it is an inappropriate use of power, and that they want to control plans at the local level, and that the regional authorities should not have the right to veto local plans. And so I'm encouraged that the Senate is taking a look at this, and I'm glad that people on both sides of the aisle over there are willing to make some changes that are going to be more in line with what the people of the state feel is appropriate.
Both last week and this week in her press conference, the governor has labeled efforts to strip the regional commissions of this approve or reject authority as misinformation and propaganda and so forth. This week she says she wished she had 45 minutes just to explain it thoroughly. And yet I hear others that saying that what's coming out, the groundswell of opposition is not a result of misinformation, but of finally getting accurate information. What do you think?
I think that's true. I think Act 200 was packaged. They held meetings all around the state, and nobody really said there was a crisis out there, but the information was manipulated so that it looked like there was a need for some new initiatives to control growth in the state of Vermont. And the people in the local towns, now that they're finding out just what the control means, are saying, wait a minute, this isn't what we think we need, this isn't what we want, and this isn't the way we want our state to be run, and the way our towns to be run. So they want to control their own destiny in their own town, and they don't want their neighbors being able to change what they want to do in their own town, and I think that's appropriate. And I think the governor is just way off track by saying they don't know what the law means, because I think they do know, finally, what the law means, and they don't like it.
Another subject that took up a great deal of the press conference was the budget. And I understand that the Republican caucus has come up with a list of recommended cuts. It seems like the one party incorporating both cuts and program cuts and new taxes, both parties incorporating both concepts, but one leaning more toward the cuts and one leaning more towards the taxes. You want to respond to that?
Sure. We came out with a package of cuts that we proposed to the Appropriations Committee on Tuesday, and that was in the morning before the governor changed her revenue projections for both this year and next year. But our emphasis all along has been that before we start a dialogue on raising taxes, that you have to try and cut the fat out of government, because when times are lean, people don't have the excess money to pay for luxuries for themselves and to pay to increase state spending. So I think the responsible thing to do is to take a hard look at the budget. Where is there fat? Where can we cut? And it was responsible of us, who are saying we don't want to raise taxes, to propose some cuts, and that's what the administration and the Democrats had been calling for. They said, if you don't want to raise taxes, where do you want to cut? So we told them where we wanted to cut, and we came up with close to $30 million in cuts for the FY91 budget that we presented to the Appropriations Committee, and I hope they're going to take those cuts in the spirit in which the suggestions were offered, and that was in truly trying to solve a problem for the state of Vermont, because we don't deny there's a problem, but it's how you're going to approach it. Are you immediately going to try to raise money to fix it, or are you going to do the more difficult thing, which is going to take a hard look, try and scrutinize the budget, make some cuts, and then decide whether in fact you still need more revenues?
In talking about cuts, the governor conceded that there may be an opportunity to make some more cutbacks across the board, but was unwilling to identify any areas where whole programs would be cut. Your proposals, do they include cutting whole programs?
In a couple of instances, but not significant programs and not programs that directly affect people. I'm glad to see that the governor is finally talking about cuts, because it is not a word that she's uttered with much frequency lately. She's uttered the word taxes a whole lot. And so I think that she's kind of dangling over the edge of the cliff and finally is realizing that she's got to cut too.
One of the largest cuts that you proposed was $2.5 million from state aid to education. I know that education is funded by state aid, but also by property taxes. A $2.5 million cut from the state aid, isn't that going to bounce right back and have the taxpayers picking up on property tax?
Well, state aid to education is, in fact, Bruce, property tax relief. And what we really recommended was that $2.5 million be shifted to property tax relief, that we would rather have it go directly to the people who need it most in those towns than in the form of state aid to education, which doesn't go to every town. Conversely, we recommended an increase in funding over either the governor's appropriation or the state board recommendation in special education. And I think if you talk to educators, and I have asked educators this specific question, if you had to choose, where would you rather have the money, in your special ed or your state aid? And they'll all say special ed. And the reason is there's absolutely no flexibility in the special education situation. It is a mandated program, federally mandated. They have got to provide it. They've got to provide it for every child, and they have to provide specified things. And it's very expensive, and every single town in the state has to do it. So we're recommending that we fund the special ed formula at 46%, which is what the commitment was when we passed the new funding formula a couple of years ago, but not the commitment suggested by either the state board or the governor this year. So I think that we really are helping the towns educationally more by doing that, and helping the property tax burden statewide, because every town will benefit from that. And you know, in your local school budget, the budgets are tight, and I'd be the first person to admit that, but there's a little bit of flexibility. I mean, you can move the money around a little bit, and you can't do that in special ed. You've got to pay for it, and you've got to pay for every dollar.
Is there one other cut in your list of cuts? I know that several were relating to the executive and the legislative areas. Is there other cuts in there that you'd like to highlight?
Well, you know, we really felt strongly that if you're going to recommend cuts, you ought to start at home, and that the legislators ought to be willing to take some cuts too. So we recommended that meal allowances be changed to correspond to what the state employees get. State employees get approximately $21 a day in meal allowances, and the legislative meal allowance is much more generous than that, close to twice that amount, and if you stay in Montpelier. And I think it's only appropriate that legislators be allowed to spend the same amount of money as state employees on their meal allowance. So that was one recommendation. We also recommended that there not be any summer study committees in FY91. It is something that has been used to excess, I think, particularly in the last year. And it's an election year. You don't know who's returning to the legislature. I don't see a lot of need for study committees next summer, though in election years in the past there have been study committees. So we look to cut some money out of the legislative budget there. And we also suggested freezing out-of-state travel for legislators at taxpayers' expense for the first 6 months of FY91. So we're willing to cut ourselves if we're going to cut everybody else, and I think that's appropriate.
Thank you, Sarah. We hope you enjoyed the first half of our program. Stay tuned. In the second half, we'll be talking with the chairman of the state Democratic Party and the state Republican Party. We'll be right back. Democrat and Republican are labels that we throw around quite a bit, and yet if you're a little unclear on exactly what that means to be a Democrat or a Republican, you're not alone.
I don't really have an answer for
Don't you?
that.
What do you think is the distinct difference between Democrats and Republicans?
She's in Vermont. It's hard to tell.
Is it hard?
Yeah. I'm not sure. What do you?
Well, the show is called Inside the State House, but we've actually gone outside the State House, 2 doors down on Court Street, here in the headquarters for the state Vermont Republican Party. And we'll go from here over to Main Street to the Democratic headquarters for their state party. And we're here talking with the chairman of the Vermont Republican Party, Walter Freed. Walter, I've been 8 weeks now in the legislature, kind of new at it, but I'm looking for some clear distinctions between Democrat and Republicans. I know talking with people on the street, there isn't a clear distinction. Even talking with some legislators, they see those distinctions being blurred. In your mind, what is it that makes a Republican? What is a fundamental, non-negotiable principle that makes a person a Republican?
I think some of the basic principles that we Republicans believe in, things that we hold very dear, are certainly the rights of the individual, that the government serves the people best as a government that is closest to the people, and that is probably, as opposed to a bureaucracy or a system that, a centralized government that will dictate what is best for the people. So that one of the basic principles of the Republican Party is that concept of the individual, the importance of the individual, the opportunities for the individual, equal opportunities, equal rights, equal justice. But it does center on individual liberties and freedom.
Well, I know that when they talk about elections and they talk about issues and votes and so forth in the legislature, the party seems to be a very important aspect of any of the goings-on. And yet, when you talk to people individually, one-on-one, they don't consider party allegiance to be a very foremost thing in their thinking. Do people fall into a party and then they're expected to flow along with it, or aren't they carefully enough assessing what a party's principles are before they join it? Why this vague situation?
I think, again, we're talking Vermont politics in particular and how people get involved in political parties. We have people that around the state have served for years in the Republican Party and political parties in general, who may not have been a legislator and had any process in the State House. And on the other side of that, we have some people that are recruited, whether as Republicans or Democrats, that maybe had little political activity prior to being recruited. Somebody came up to them and said, we want you to run for the state legislature, we want you to run as a Republican or run as a Democrat. And because of this, then they've got some tie to that political party. For the most part, I think in this state here, people, especially at the local level, the town level, don't identify as much with political parties as they do issues, as individual issues and how they affect them. So that an individual legislator, again, is not tied, is less likely to be tied to a certain political philosophy as he is the representation of that community. And I think in our own party, we certainly don't require anybody to march lockstep with a Republican agenda to serve in the legislature. We are certainly, as a requirement or an identification with a party, we look to somebody who runs as a Republican to vote for the House choice in the Speaker's race. I think that's an absolute given. But outside of that, everyone really has to vote their conscience when they're identifying with their community. They have to vote, what the needs of their community are as they represent that community at the state level. But there are still a lot of things that come back to the Republican principles and Republican ideals that I think differentiate us from the Democrats. Probably to even follow up on that when I talk about the individuality that we believe in and the importance of the individual, to best frame that, I would go back to a statement that Governor Kunin made to the Rotary Club in Rutland back, I think it was March 1989, and at that time the discussion was centered around the role that government was playing, the increasing role that government was playing in the lives of the individuals. And her comment at that time was that the greater the freedom from government interference, the greater the risk to society. And that she followed it up with, and she said, the greater the government control, the less risk to society. And I think Republicans are completely opposite from that viewpoint. I think her administration, and the Democrats clearly show that right now, that we have a larger bureaucracy today than what we did when Dick Snelling left office. We have more government employees, at least 10% more government employees, and their central planning, their central elitism of the Kunin administration is really a we know better attitude, and we will dictate here from Montpelier. And this is very much, I think, what we see as a difference between the Republicans and the Democrats.
I think if Governor Kunin were here, she would point to the efficiency of scale. You can do it on a statewide level more efficiently, cost efficiently, than you can doing it in several different local scales.
Well, that's probably the same argument that a lot of Eastern European countries have made over their type of government over the last 50 years. And we've seen that that isn't working, that didn't work, and that really isn't the efficiency to be found. Even the Vermont Constitution really guarantees the individual, the right to hold their own property, the right to hold their own monies, their own wealth in their own pockets, and that government should only be taking that away from them if it is going to serve a much greater good and clearly identified. This is part of Vermont's history, it's part of Vermont's heritage. I think it's very important. When we do look at it, whether it's the Act 200 issue of regional planning dictating to the towns and saying that regionalism is better, I have a lot of problems with that, and Republicans as a whole have a lot of problems with that. Not the concept, perhaps, of planning, but the concepts that, we're going to centralize everything and tell you, this is how to run your lives. And that, in the Kunin administration, it wasn't just with the concept of how Act 200 was put out there, or of the centralized forms of government that we see here in Montpelier, the big push for, but also in even her concept of regional school systems and centralizing them into larger superintendencies where they would cover a much greater region and there would be less school districts. They would be combined into more of them. It follows that same concept of really taking that individuality, that local control issue, and bringing it to a higher body. I think if that concept continued, you'd see a much stronger county government over the years in Vermont, and that's something that we'd be opposed to.
Maybe just as a closing question, you could give us some of what you expect in this fall's elections. I know it's early, we're still in February, but I know that some Republicans are hoping to see a turnaround in terms of dominance in the houses.
Certainly, I'm hoping for that. Perhaps it is early for the average Vermonter to be thinking about elections in November 1990 as much as I am and as much as this office is. But on the statewide races, we're looking for a very productive Republican year. We have every intention of making Vermont a Republican state in 1990. And in our legislative races for the House and Senate, we think we have an excellent opportunity to come up with a majority in the House and the Senate. We see the pendulum turning. We're swinging in a move that's bringing us out of the latter part of the 80s and into the 90s with a concern over the management of Vermont and what direction Vermont is going in, a concern for not only social issues in Vermont, family issues in Vermont, but also the state of the economy here. And the people in Vermont are looking for Republican leadership to take them into the decade of the 90s. So I expect this to be a very productive, a very successful campaign year.
Thank you, Walter. We've been talking with Walter Freed, chairman of the Vermont Republican Party. Well, I'm here in the state Democratic headquarters on Main Street here in Montpelier. I'm talking with Violet, or Vi as she prefers to be called Vi Coffin, the chairman of the state Democratic Committee. Vi, what are you working on this time of year?
Well, we're working this time of year, as we work every time of year, on electing Democrats, finding candidates, raising money, formulating campaign plans, doing a lot of research on what the voting patterns in the state have been.
Is there one ideology which is a hardline Democrat where it's immovable?
No, I don't. I think there are a number of issues that are predominantly Democratic issues, and one of them is the notion that taxation should hit the people who are most able to pay, and that it should be a progressive thing. And that's why generally I think you will find the Democrats favoring an increase in the income tax over the kind of taxes that fall hardest on some of those least able to pay. And while you'll find Democrats pushing for property tax rebates, pushing, and so far it's been unsuccessful, for second home tax, which would take some of the burden off Vermont taxpayers, and why on the national scene, and with the support of the Vermont Democratic Party, we've taken a very strong stand in opposition to any cut in the capital gains tax, and why a lot of people up here are looking with considerable interest at Senator Moynihan's proposals on Social Security taxation.
You mentioned earlier that you're working on this fall's elections. And I understand that the progressives have two coalitions now formed a super coalition. Do you see that impacting on your party's efforts in the fall at all?
It will have an impact if Bernie Sanders decides to run for something, whether it be governor or Congress, because these are his people. And I don't think it'll have that much impact on other races. I mean, the progressive Democrats who've run as Democrats will continue to do so, and I doubt that the progressive Rainbow Coalition will have a great deal of success in recruiting candidates to run for the legislature as third-party people. Maybe in a few places, but I don't see it as being a very big factor.
Thank you very much, Vi.